Hai Sobat HI, welcome back to Podcast Hubungan Internasional or IR Podcast. The podcast is organized by the Department of International Relations, Universitas Gadjah Mada. I'm Marwa, who will be hosting the podcast today. I'm here with Daniel, a visiting lecturer in our department. Hello, Daniel. How are you?
Thank you. I'm Marwa. I'm good. Thank you.
So welcome back to our podcast. I suppose this is not the first time you are coming to our podcast, right?
No, done some before, yes.
Yeah, but today we will be discussing different topic in line with the recent publications from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we are going to discuss about the Climate Change Report 2022. This latest report certainly talk about the ever-present issues of climate crisis. In general, the report talks about the state of climate change, highlighting the cause and also consequences, and most importantly, the possible solutions together we can develop. Many would describe the report as concerning and bleak. I have read it several pages from the report myself, and I would admit that I share the same view, and it kind of get me some kind of anxiety after reading the report. But I wonder if we still have hope in the future facing the climate crisis, and do we still have time to adapt? And before we delve into it, probably I would ask Daniel to briefly explain to our audience what these IPCC reports are and why are they important. Please, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Mama. Yeah, definitely the situation is bleak. I think there's still hope, but let's talk more about that later. First, a little bit about like this IPCC. Yeah, I mean, a lot of abbreviations when it comes to climate science and climate politics. Yeah. What it means is that it's called the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, as you already noted. And it is a intergovernmental organization set up by the United Nations in 1998 by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Program. So it's been around for quite a while. And the target of this IPCC is to bring together the best scientists worldwide who deal with questions of climate change and all the impact of climate change, and basically to advise governments on how to best deal with the problem. Yeah? And one of the core of this IPCC are these assessment reports. So now we have the sixth, so it's kind of already 6 reports. So in usually every 5 to 7 years, one of these reports comes out. And we are now in the 6th cycle of these. And these reports consist of 3 working groups that look at kind of different areas of climate science. So the working group 1 looks at kind of the physical science basis. So how does the climate system work? How do we know that climate change exists, and how can we measure it, and so on and so on. The second working group looks at the kind of impact. So what does climate change do to the world, to humans, to systems, to the environment? And how can we adapt to climate change? And the third working group, it looks at mitigation. So how can we cut best down on greenhouse gases, on carbon dioxide, on methane? The report that came out that we're talking about mainly today is from the second working group. So the one that focuses on impacts and adaptation and vulnerability.
Okay, so as you said before, there are many aspects from this committee and also these reports, and some of it are quite difficult to understand sometimes because they use many technical terms. And so for us, it can be hard to understand. So if you would sum up the main takeaways from this report, probably in 3 points, what would they be?
Well, first, I think the report gives us a bleak assessment of the situation like it is. Yeah, things are already pretty bad when it comes to climate change. We are at about 1.1 degree of average warming. That doesn't mean that warming is the same everywhere in the world. Some regions warm faster, some slower, but it already has major impacts on kind of extreme events, systems, and so on. And as a lot of warming is already baked in, given how much carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases we have released and are still releasing, things are definitely still gonna get worse. But I think there's also a message of kind of hope here. So it's not everything's lost, run for the shelter, but there are things that we can do. So we're not like we're in a grave situation, but we're not in a terrible situation yet. So I think humanity can still, if we kind of push for it, we can still turn things around as much as possible to prevent risks and harms to our generation and future generations. So that's one. The report, I think the final paragraph of the summary for policymakers that the report has sums this up pretty well. So let me just quote. It says, climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. Any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. So it means we really have to act in the next 5, 10, 15 years to cut down greenhouse gases, to adapt to those changes that are already there. Otherwise, we will really face very, very bleak and terrible consequences. Second, I think there are a lot of new insights on climate risk in the report. And I think it's for the first time, it really delves into the questions of what biosphere means to us. Yeah. So before it was like, of course, it talked about extinction and on ecosphere, biosphere, impacts of climate change. But this report really clearly says that we and the biosphere and the climate, it's one cycle of life on this planet. Yeah. And if we destroy and if we disturb one of them, then we are going to be harmed as human beings. Yeah. So there is no kind of just doing a bit of climate mitigation, not thinking about biosphere, but we can only survive well as humanity, basically as human species, if also other species and living spheres of other species are doing well as well. So this is, I think, a very important message. Second, I think in terms of risk, it looks much more at compound and cascading risks. So risks that kind of connect, how risks interconnect, how they strengthen each other sometimes. So I think this is also kind of quite new from the report, or at least kind of in much more detail than in previous report. And third, I think it talks a lot about kind of climate resilient development and climate justice. And it shows that basically any development decision that we take right now can bring us either closer to catastrophe or it can bring us closer to climate justice. Yeah? So there is no development decision that kind of doesn't touch on this kind of climate compound. So it's a big elephant in the room, yeah, and it will stay that way. Yeah. So basically, we should kind of make climate resilient development one of the core principles of any kind of economic or human development on this planet.
I see. So as you mentioned, there are 3 points. If I could sum up, climate change, it's indeed a threat. It's here. It's not a future problem. It's today's problem. And you mentioned there are at least 3, right? The risks, and then the variety of risks, how it is today problem, and then also the last one is climate resilient development. Let's start with the first one about risk. You mentioned something about cascading and compounding risk. Can you please elaborate more on that?
Well, but before we go to that, maybe let's talk about risk in a bit more general. What the IPCC already has a kind of methodology about risk that we know basically from disaster science. So how we calculate risk is by looking at a number of factors and variables. One is the exposure, so like the hazard. Yeah, so this can be the strong wind or the heat or the storm or the tsunami or whatever. But if that touches nowhere where kind of humans are living or humans have any interest, then it doesn't become really risk. Yeah. So the main factor, or one of the main factors when it comes to risk, is vulnerability. Yeah? So the report focuses a lot about kind of vulnerability. Yeah? So kind of makes a difference, you know, if your house is built well, or if you are healthy, if you can evacuate on your feet, or if you're in a wheelchair, for example, or if you're rich enough to move somewhere else, or if you're rich enough, if it's very hot, to have an air condition or not. And these things, these kind of vulnerabilities play a big role when it comes to risk. And then there's also the capacity, of course, how can we deal and handle with risk? So the strength of a risk comes down to these three factors. We all know that from climate change, I don't think I need to go too much into that, that we will see. I mean, of course, more heat means more heat waves, but also more precipitation means more stronger rain, probably more floods, changes in hurricanes and tropical storms, tornadoes, but also some areas will get drier, some get wetter, then we have sea level rise, and so on and so on. So we have a myriad, of course, of climate impact. Some of them we already see. Some will, of course, and many of them will get stronger in the future. So all of these, of course, is in detail described in the report. I think what's really strong and new in this report is that we evaluate a little bit how eminent these risks are. And I think it's become more, the warning level is higher. So a lot of major risks already kind of will materialize at 1.5 degrees of warming, and will get worse and worse when we come to 2 degrees or 2.5. I mean, at the moment, given current climate policies, we are on track to something plus minus 3 degrees, we have to say. So we really kind of, it is of the essence that we kind of cut temperature increases. And then we can see from the report, looking at risk on two kind of levels. On the one level, it looks at kind of the biosphere. Again, this is the relatively new and detailed part of the report, where it shows while kind of most human beings, of course, there are people who migrate, there are people who get displaced from climate change, but mostly we can still adapt in most places, as human beings. But animals and species are already on the move, because temperatures are getting warmer. We see that almost half of the species in the world are moving, So either to farther north where it's cooler, or farther up mountains where it's also cooler. And of course, there are limits to that, because if you're on Java Island, there's not much place you can move other than higher up, for example, towards the volcanoes, or in the north, towards the Arctic and so on. So there are limits to that. And it's not only, if we talk about species, we don't only talk about animals or insects, we also talk about trees and plants. It's not that the trees get feet and start walking, of course, but their seeds can kind of make new seeds, new trees grow a couple of 50 or 100 meters. So there are limits to how fast species and plants can kind of migrate. And the current changes in temperatures, they are really threatening kind of extinction for many of the species. So the report actually says that if it comes to 5 degrees of warming, up to half of all species on the planet could be faced with extinction. Of course, there are ranges in terms of kind of how dangerous and how risky everything is, but we are in the middle of a huge biosphere crisis. And we really haven't been taking care of nature as human beings. So not even with climate change, but we are destroying the forests, we're draining the peatlands, there are much too little protected areas for animals, for species, and so on and so on. We're still cutting down more forests than we regrow. So we really need to rethink how we kind of deal with nature, with other species, or otherwise it will kind of hurt us. It will come back basically to bite us. So that's kind of one main area when it comes to risk. When it comes to kind of the human component of risk, the report is also very stark in terms of arguing that almost half, basically 3.3 to 3.6 billion people, so almost half of all people in the world, are already living in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change. It highlights a number of regions, so like in Africa, West, Central, East Africa. Then there is Central and South America, South Asia, small island developing states, and the Arctic. These are particularly vulnerable zones when it comes to climate risks. But also like the report often talks about like tropical areas, of course, and also about, coastal areas, because of sea level rise and so on. So Indonesia is also quite in the spotlight if you think about that in terms of risk. And but what the report also says, it's not only about where you live, because how the weather is, how the climate is in that area, but how we will be impacted very much depends on the vulnerabilities of people. And this can be, we have said, related to poverty, to government challenges. So if you can do adaptation policies well, if you have social systems, if you have healthcare and so on. Yeah? Many people, particularly in the developing countries in the global south, have limited access to health services and resources. A conflict, of course, is a big threat multiplier when it comes to vulnerability. Just thinking about Syria or like Somalia and so on, a lot of countries in Africa that have internal conflicts, Mali in the Sahel zone, where it's very difficult also to kind of deal with climate change just because of the conflict environment, for example. Also, things like gender, ethnicity, there's often discrimination in terms of gender because of ethnicity. Indigenous groups often have little say and so on. Those are also things that the report highlights that compound vulnerability. Yeah? And it's very strongly highlights that we're just going the wrong way in many respects. Yeah? So how we consume, how we produce is just simply unsustainable. Yeah? And if we don't turn this around very soon, then we will face very dire consequences.
So that's a lot to hear about climate risk. If I were to sum up, one thing that you have highlighted here also how then risk and vulnerability and also the capacities to deal with climate change are unequal, across geographies, across social group, identities, economy, and political stability of each of the regions. So it's a very complex issues when it comes to climate risk. But are there any ways to minimize this climate risk?
Yes, of course. I mean, first and foremost, and I think that kind of is the first truth of dealing with climate change is that we need to mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah? So this is not the main part of this report. This is the other working groups that deal more with these kind of issues. But basically, as the Paris Agreement, the big climate treaty says, we need to keep temperature rising from to maximum of 2 degrees, ideally as close as possible to 1.5 degrees of warming. We're already at 1.1, and the way we're going, we're going to probably be at 1.5 in 2030, between 2030 and 2040. So there is not a big window left. So really transforming our energy, transport systems, and so on, is of the highest importance. The second, of course, we can limit risk from climate change. This is called usually in the terms, it's called adaptation, climate change adaptation. So we can adapt to climate change. The report also highlights a lot of examples where that works and how that works. We know a lot of things, how it works. We still need to learn a lot of things also in terms of adaptation. But the report is a bit cautious, slightly pessimistic about the shape of how adaptation basically has been done so far. So it says that most adaptation is mostly done on a small scale, that it's unevenly distributed, that it's much often focuses just on the short term, not on the medium and long term, and that much is still in the stage of planning and not in implementation. So what is probably needed, given the scale of the climate crisis, is that we need complex, long-term and transformative adaptation solutions. We just can't fiddle a bit here and fiddle a bit there and think everything is done. It's not going to work. And we know, from real world, and I just have to look in many cities, politicians and decision makers, they just big shiny things, like seawalls or moving up a street and so on. They like these big, strong infrastructure adaptation. But what we actually need is a lot more adaptation that looks at kind of how we do things, about learning, about social change, also about dealing with the biosphere, helping kind of nature to adapt and so on. And of that, we have way, way too little.
Yes, Daniel, I do agree with what you have just mentioned about the report, how there is a tendency to prioritize these technical infrastructural solutions. As we probably have seen in Indonesia as well, climate adaptation, it's not about transforming the already exploitative development path, but, just giving it band-aid so they can continue doing whatever they're doing. And one of the things that is also highlighted to achieve transformative climate adaptation is the knowledge. If I'm not mistaken, the IPCC report as well in 2019 highlights about the gap in adaptations, which includes finance, technology, and also the knowledge. The knowledge gap, especially on the experience and the capacity of the Global South in dealing with climate change impacts, are currently under research. I wonder if the report talks about this. Do we see more representatives from the Global South in the report?
Yes. I mean, overall, the IPCC, of course, has been criticized before that there is unequal representation in terms of gender and also in terms of North-South. I think they've learned a lot, so things have changed. So I think the gender ratio is way up in this report. And also, I think from what I looked at in terms of authors and what the IPCC has released, the North-South gap definitely has softened in this report. It doesn't mean that it appeared. And it's also, a problem is that most, best universities, research universities, many of them are in the global north. So there are also kind of just how academic infrastructure is distributed in the world kind of makes an impact here. Yeah. So even if you try hard, sometimes it's really difficult to kind of fully come to an equal understanding here. But a lot of researchers now also working like kind of, in big universities in the north are researchers from the global south, and they contribute. And I think we have much more studies and so on, and much more data already from the global south. Of course, there's still a big data gap in many respects, particularly when it comes to Africa. I think there are simple lacks. Some countries have, for example, very basic systems to predict weather, to kind of collect data and so on. And then it's, of course, difficult to kind of make models, for example, or make predictions. Yeah. Then if you are like in Europe where you have like weather systems every 10 kilometers or something like that, of course, you get a different kind of data, for example. So I think there's a need also for the global north to support the global south in kind of providing and sustaining that infrastructure to kind of collect data. But I think the report is quite interesting in terms of it's the first that really strongly talks about climate justice when it comes to adaptation. And it really looks also first time, I think, might have been there, but from what I noticed, that it really kind of highlights also questions of kind of past injustices like colonialism and what has been done to indigenous peoples in the past. Yeah. So one line from the summary for policymakers, for example, reads, present development challenges causing high vulnerability are influenced by historical and ongoing patterns of inequity, such as colonialism, especially for many indigenous peoples and local communities. Yeah, I really can't remember any kind of that clear language from any of the previous reports. And generally, I teach climate justice and research on climate justice. I think there is a huge gap in terms of climate justice when it comes to climate change. Most emissions are caused by the north. Most benefits of emitting those emissions have been collected by the north, so historically and still now. So I think the global north definitely has some duty to support the global south in both mitigating and adapting to climate change. And these reports also definitely talk about those issues. Yeah, as you said, climate finance, particularly in terms of adaptation, is still very small compared to what is really needed. No? But, kind of these justice gaps should also not become an excuse for like countries in the global south to just put their hands up and say, oh, sorry, we can't do anything. Yeah. So there's a lot of things in terms of adaptation that can be done that are not very expensive, that just require, political will and participation of people. And so on.
Yes, I'm happy to hear that even though the gap is still there, but there are progress in this matter. Some of the issues that you mentioned previously, like colonialism and an uneven development, are something that, and climate justice, something that were previously not recognized when we were talking about climate change. But today, in today's report, at least these issues are being included. And again, the unequal impacts of climate change are also included in the recent report. And one of the things that is also new from this report is you mentioned previously about climate resilient development. We have heard about the term resilience quite often for the past few years, considering about climate change threats and the need for our development path to modify, to adapt to the climate change. And I wonder, what does climate resilient development mean?
Well, climate resilient development means that basically as every development decision that we really make from now on brings us either closer to or farther away from a climate resilient future. So we should just, any decision we make about we should think about what does it do to mitigation? Does it produce more greenhouse gases? Does it cut down greenhouse gases? What does it do to adaptation? Does it make us more resilient? Does it help to minimize risk, or does it create additional risks? And also, what does it do in terms of justice? Does it help those who are the most vulnerable, that most need kind of development, or does it just help, the rich and powerful? Maybe just a little bit here, the report talks quite strongly about the kind of, one hand, also there's big limits to adaptation. Yeah, so there are soft limits, meaning that limits that we might be able to change, such as political will or lack of finance, or there are hard limits. So some systems like coral reefs, for example, they just can't survive maybe 2+ degrees of warming. We already see coral bleaching on a big level. Some grains like maize will kind of not grow in tropical region or some tropical region with 2 degrees of warming and so on. So that's why we really need to kind of keep temperatures down, but because we only can adapt to a certain level. Yeah? So if we have 3-4 degrees of warming for a lot of systems, we simply will not be able to adapt anymore. And then basically it will hit us fully. The risk will hit us head on. Yeah? And there's not much that we can do about it. Yeah? So we are like really having in terms of kind of loss and damage, how it's called in terms of climate. And a lot of adaptation can become maladaptation. So if it's only short term, if it's only focusing in one sector, it can easily become maladaptation. Yeah? I mean, the report highlights, for example, seawalls. So most seawalls, so they protect maybe the coastal area for a couple of years. They are very expensive, and they undermine natural solutions. Yeah, and they make actually areas much more vulnerable over time. Yeah? But politicians love seawalls. Yeah, for example. So we have to be really careful when it comes, and that brings me back to this question of climate resilient development, that the things that we do even to deal with climate change make sense, also in the long term for future generations. Yeah? So we have to be really smart in terms of taking decisions that help us now, of course, but also that have a mid to long term perspective. Yeah? And it might mean sometimes that we might need to give up things, that we might to retreat, for example, from the sea level rather than building seawalls, or might have to resettle people. And particularly, I mean, the report, I think it's very clear about it. It is a justice question, climate resilient development. A lot more people are living in cities now. Urbanization is ongoing. Yeah, a lot of people are very vulnerable to climate change are living in informal settlement or like settlements that expand very fast. Yeah, and just look at Jakarta or any big Indonesian city, who lives in the floodplain, who is the first to get flooded if the rains come. And if we want climate resilient development, we need to help those people first and foremost who are the most vulnerable. So we need to put money in the hand, and also we need to what we call procedural justice. So we can't just have top-down development, development agency coming and saying, oh, we're doing this now and this now and this now. This is not how it works anymore. Yeah, so we need to kind of get people on board. Yeah, ask people about their own experience, about bringing their knowledge. Yeah, and get their support. Yeah, because otherwise, you get backlash. Yeah, if government just says, oh, we're moving this community. Yeah, and don't ask anyone, then you have people demonstrating, and then you have conflict. Yeah, so it creates conflict. So if we want to be smart, we need to be inclusive in how we do this development. Yeah, it's also kind of, I think, an important point that the report highlights. Yeah, and much stronger again. This kind of we cannot only kind of do climate resilient development for looking at our cities, at our economy, but we really need to take stewardship for nature, for biodiversity serious. Yeah, so if you don't do that, then it's really gonna end up very badly for us as a species.
Yeah, that's a fresh perspective on climate change, I would say, talking about climate resilient development, because before we might have heard how climate adaptation effort in some area often comes at the cost of injustice and yet, as you said before, conflict. So probably now we need to think of an alternative where justice and then also climate adaptation integrates into one approach, as the report has proposed about climate resilient development. But one of the things you also mentioned is that the window of opportunity for climate resilient development is closing. So if we don't act now, we might lose all the opportunities. And this brings to my last questions. How do you think members of academia, community, be it students, lecturers, staff, university, can advance climate resilient development?
Okay, thank you so much, Marwa. Well, I think even when the IPCC presented the report last week, they actually highlighted this need for academia and education providers on all levels to really play an important role in this climate transition. And particularly they highlight that we need to develop content and curricula that deals with all the aspects of the climate emergency, and that we take the climate emergency seriously. And this, I'm very fortunate and happy to be able to teach a course on climate justice here at UGM, for basically open for all UGM students. So we're doing the second term now, and it's great, but I think we really need to integrate climate change much deeper into all departments, into kind of all research centers and so on. And climate change is, if you look at these reports, it is an interdisciplinary endeavor. Yeah? So there are researchers from all disciplines can contribute, and that's why we need to train our students also to work together interdisciplinarily and to think about climate change interdisciplinarily. Yeah? So economic students, forestry students, IR students, health students, and so on, everybody can contribute, and all these areas have questions and challenges that are linked to climate change, yeah, and that should and can be integrated into the curriculum. And then, of course, we are major research providers. Yeah, a lot of the people who are part of the IPCC reports, of course, are university researchers, postdocs, pre-docs, and so on. So, also master students who, there is, of course, tons and tons of things we still don't know, particularly when it comes to adaptation. I think in mitigation, science is well established and so on, but in terms of adaptation, there's just so many different areas where we still can learn things, where we still can study things. So we need much more of that, of course. Yeah? Then also universities are not isolated, ivory towers, and they should not be. So universities should really engage with their surroundings and see how they can support local communities, local economies, and so on, to make this climate transition, to kind of spread knowledge, good practices, engage with communities, and so on. We should also be just maybe a word of caution, be a little careful as universities not to be swallowed up in like greenwashing attempts of big business. Yeah, like oil companies now and other companies, resource companies, they like to, we are so green and like we all net zero by 2050 and so on. Often this is kind of just words and a lot of greenwashing. So we should be very careful to kind of not becoming fig leaves for big business just because they give us a couple of $1,000 or whatever for events and so on. So we should be sometimes critical and also see like kind of who we cooperate with. It's nothing bad to support like those companies going green, but it should be clear that they really do it, and that's not kind of just using the reputation of academic institutions to kind of wash their reputation, greenwash their reputation. Then, of course, we all need to learn. These reports are great. Not everyone is going to read these 3,500 pages, of course. Yeah, I'm also skimming it. I don't have the time to go through every line. Also, it's very interesting. But there are big gaps in what people know about climate change. Just the basics. Yeah. In particular, I think from surveys, we see that often these gaps are still very prevalent in the global south. So everyone at university can first learn about climate change and then talk to people, talk to family, talk to friends, talk to neighbors, so that people are aware, because the changes are coming. Yeah. So even if you don't know, if you don't want to care about it, the bad things are in the pipeline, are coming or are already here, So we need to engage with the topic much more. And of course, then last but not least, everybody can, of course, be part of this green transition. Yeah? Politically, we are voters, so we can maybe have a little influence on the political process or engage ourselves politically on the local, regional, national level. Or if not, if you think the political system cannot accommodate fast enough, then maybe we join the climate movement, Fridays for Future or Extinction Rebellion, and block some roads and or do something, to other non-violent methods that we can do, kind of to make pressure on companies, pressure on governments to take climate change seriously. And of course, every small action that we do in our lives to kind of cut down our own carbon footprint help. Yeah, of course, it won't make a big change, but going green in terms of transportation, flying less, eating less meat, turning off the air conditioner or the light if we don't need it, and so on and so on. Small changes make a difference. It also shows our friends and neighbors that we basically kind of, care about climate change, that climate change is important, that we support the transition. And as the report really says, any increment of temperature rise makes climate change less risky. So really, if you can even 0.1 degrees of change, if you can keep the temperatures down, it will save lives. Yeah, it will, save us from a lot of $1 billion of damages. Yeah, so in a sense, we all need to do as much as we can do as possible. But of course, the big transformation needs to be societal. So we need laws, we need policies to kind of cut emissions, do an adaptation. We can't do it on our own, but I think everybody can make at least a little bit of a contribution.
Thank you. That's a very hopeful message. Despite the depressing beginning of the talk, now we kind of end our discussion with a more encouraging and empowering part of the discussions to ask you, Sobat HI, everyone, you can take a part in this effort of building the climate resilient development. Daniel has mentioned several ways in which you can take part. Maybe start small. It might not create the big change, but it is something. And before we end this talk, Daniel, probably you can give some kind of concluding remarks to sum up our discussion today.
Oh, well, I think that most things, again, I think we need really, it is of the highest importance to cut our global emissions as fast as possible. And I think one thing the report also clearly highlights when it comes to carbon resilient development, we have it has this nice graph, where you have like tree branches. So you have different, so we have some are red, some are yellow, some are green. Yeah? So it depends which decisions we take. Yeah? If we take the greener decisions, we come up and towards a more safe world. If we take the wrong decisions, we take the red path or the yellow. If it's not neither bad or good. Yeah, and each decision that we make as countries go in one have to go in one direction or the other. But of course, like humans are diverse, like each country, each economy is diverse. So we each have to have our own pathway. Yeah? Of course, economies in the global south, they have not emitted that many greenhouse gas emissions historically and so on. There's still a lot of poverty, still a lot of inequality. So we have to square, this issue of kind of going green with kind of how we can help those who are most vulnerable and weak in our societies, without hurting those. I think this is kind of a very big, important imperative. Second, climate justice, like North-South, is really needed and it is kind of the right thing to do. So I think countries of the global South, they should be much more demanding still of the global North in terms of help. But I think what works best is if you say we are doing this, we are motivated, we want to do this, help us, rather than just sitting and and complaining. Yeah. So I think you need a proactive kind of climate policy. I think Indonesia has this in some part, saying kind of, we'll do more mitigation, for example, if you support us. But I think can be a bit more, still more aggressive and kind of pushy in terms of kind of saying, hey, you caused much of the problem. Yeah, you need to help us, but we have a plan. Yeah, we really have a plan to do so. And I think then also kind of climate financing will go easy. And it's also, I think it's a bit of a competition in a sense of like kind of, countries that have the best plan, they will get more financing, they will have a better transition, they will face less risk in the long term. So to invest in this transition really makes sense. Yeah. So economically it makes sense, but politically in terms of safety, health, and so on. So there are a lot of co-benefits. Yeah. I mean, of course there are costs, but in terms of money, but in terms of co-benefits, long-term, mid-term, long-term, it really will pay
off. Okay, sure. That ends our discussion today. So hopefully this can at least bring you insight on what is the current state of climate change that we are facing right now, and the urgency and the way at least we can take part to facilitate, to pursue the climate resilient development. I agree, the report is heavy, but still I recommend you to at least give it a try, at least the policy summary part of the report. Probably you will get the big idea of, the urgency of the problem that we are facing today. So once again, yes, please.
Marwa, sorry for jumping in. Each of these reports, it has a summary for policymakers that is like 30 plus pages. So
yes.
Now if you have limited time, just read. The idea is that, presidents and prime ministers and ministers and whatever, they have little time to read. They have a lot of other issues on their head. So at least they should read this kind of short report. And the great thing about the summary for policymakers also is that they have been signed off. Every word in this summary for policymaking has been agreed to by all 195 governments that are part of the IPCC. So this is really kind of government saying this is kind of world sanctioned science. So kind of this is so we stand behind this science. So this is kind of, there's no other area basically of knowledge in the world that we have that has such a strong, I think, scientific and also political backing. Yeah. So if you have an hour, read this summary for policymakers. They have a lot of nice graphs and so on. So they are nice to read. Language is a bit strange at times if you read it for the first time, but after 2 or 3 pages, I'm sure you get into it.
Yes, thanks, Daniel, for backing me up. I didn't know that it has such a strong support from many countries around the world. It is important to get at least the big picture of the current state of climate change. So please do have a look. So that ends our discussion today. Once again, thanks, Daniel, for sharing your insight about the report. Hopefully, this will inspire Sobat HI to participate in the climate justice movement or research or action and many other aspects that we are currently also developing at the university. So thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Marwa. Thank you. Bye.